Hello, everyone. Today we will be discussing the advantages of single-use plastics and why we believe that single-use plastics should not be banned.
The campaign to eliminate single-use plastics is grounded both in quantifiable scientific data, which points out the harm to aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and a sense of moral obligation to reduce unneeded waste. The extended decomposition time, upwards of 450 years, in relation to the vast amount of PET plastics produced, has become a problematic issue for ecosystems and, in some cases, public health and safety. The argument can be made, however, that the total elimination of PET plastics must be reevaluated, as the compounds are in many instances necessary. Single-use plastics in various applications far exceed the simplicity of water containers and grocery bags, which have been demonized by the media. Some of the biggest culprits of single-use plastics are the world's medical facilities. Sterilization and sanitary practice in modern medicine rely on the availability of plastic. Developing nations, or those caught in natural disaster situations, face public health concerns over the availability of clean, easily transportable water. The lack thereof has drawn the attention of the World Health Organization and the United Nations in efforts to accommodate basic human needs for those displaced or lack the infrastructure and/or economic power to do so themselves. This, of course, comes in the way of PET water containers. The negative claims drawn from single-use plastic pollution are more closely related to society's proliferate consumerism mentality. The largest offenders of single-use pollution are derived from a gross lack of accountability in terms of reuse and proper waste management. This social stance goes far beyond plastics and will continue to trend in the absence of societal fundamental views on protecting the environment. In domestic terms, disaster relief efforts have relied on PET plastics to deliver aid to those struck with natural disaster. The ease of transportability, sterile properties, and the ability to store for extended periods of time have essentially been responsible for saving thousands of lives. In August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina was the deadliest hurricane to strike the Gulf Coast in the United States, claiming 1,833 lives. While the majority of fatalities were caused by drowning, thousands were displaced and homeless following the disaster. Bottled water was the cornerstone of the disaster relief effort. Though within the United States, many could argue that the need for disaster relief does not outweigh the problematic use throughout the day-to-day. A strict ban on PET plastics could dramatically diminish the manufacturing capabilities and will likely become less available when needed. Internationally, PET plastics are used daily in countries and communities who simply do not have access to clean water. In regions such as Indonesia, bottled water is not a luxury but a necessity, as the water available is impure and unsafe, and pipe networks reach less than 25% of households in Indonesia. Jakarta is the fourth most populated country in the world. However, lack of infrastructure and poverty has stricken many with poor health and access to basic human needs. Of these needs, clean water has become a growing health concern and can cause premature mortality among the population. Further east in Java, the crisis becomes worse due to the lack of piped infrastructure. The availability to refill water thins in comparison to Jakarta, and the only viable solution to aid in public safety is subsidized bottled water. Though PET plastics were introduced as an interim solution, this mode of clean water delivery is likely to continue. The issues of pollution have been exacerbated by the overconsumption of PET plastics. The current environmental and social dynamics in several global regions simply cannot sustain without the help of inexpensive clean water. The argument dives further into social issues of pollution, and countries which lack the desperation of basic human needs tend to be the biggest offenders of PET waste. The circular economy model regarding PET plastics is not only sustainable, but lacks the unforeseen second and third order effects which may arise due to a global ban on plastics. The circular economy model boasts responsibility to that of individual governments and nations inhabitants to reuse and responsibly dispose of waste. With the world's most powerful nations being the most wasteful in terms of plastics and pollution, the issue is not really on plastics, but a lack of ethics in general regarding the environment and public health and safety.
Now that we've taken a deeper look into the economic sides of single-use plastics, let's dive deeper into the ecological impacts of plastics. After doing some research online, I found 3 main points that prove that there are benefits to single-use plastics. The first one being that banning single-use plastics can cause a detriment to healthcare and disaster relief and their funding. My second point being that single-use plastics can be produced as biodegradable. The third point is that single-use plastics do help aid against food waste. That is a global problem. To elaborate on my first point on plastics and healthcare and disaster relief, hospitals need single-use plastics to prevent cross-contamination. That is the main use for single-use plastics and why they are needed. Things such as syringes, thermometer barriers, and surgical tools cannot serve multiple uses because of cross-contamination. If we were to use these tools more than once, more than likely you spread diseases and not save lives. Another reason is that plastic is cheap, durable, and disposable. If we were to get rid of single-use plastics in hospitals and try and find an alternative for these, obviously these prices go up and for the demand, which means that the prices for the hospital and healthcare ultimately go up, which results in lower income families having less of a chance to seek healthcare. Another point is that there are opportunities within hospitals for recycling plastics. As you can see here in Table 1 from Lee et al., it talks about which areas in a hospital have the most likelihood to where their plastics can be recycled. Obviously in the surgical department, it's going to be low because of cross-contamination, but places such as the cafeteria here at the top, you can see that there is high potential and there's high outcome for good quality recycling. And then to go into disaster relief, plastic is needed for survival tactics when facing natural disasters such as a hurricane. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, recommends that store-bought water bottles are a necessity in surviving through natural disasters. Because in natural disasters, it's oftentimes that our electricity is cut off, our plumbing is cut off, you have no other source of food and water other than canned foods and water bottles. To go into my second point on biodegradable single-use plastics, modern science has been able to develop 2 new forms of plastic, biodegradable plastics and bioplastics. To make bioplastics, scientists have been able to change the polymers of plastics to make these types of new bioplastics. These are made from thermoplastic polylactic acid, also known as PLA, which is much easier to say. These polymers are actually plant-based. They're usually made from cornstarch or potatoes. Because in today's society, trying to ban single-use plastics in its entirety is not a probable solution, as they are so ingrained into our daily lives. Therefore, one of the best solutions is to try and make bioplastics, which degrade easier within the sunlight. So yes, creating and burning bioplastics consumes less energy overall because once they're exposed to sunlight and oxygen, they degrade naturally faster. Also, PLA plastics do not produce carbon dioxide gases when broken down. And so apart from bioplastics, there are also biodegradable plastics. These ones are specifically engineered to break down easier. These are made from petrochemicals such as barium sulfate. And these degrade rapidly also in the presence of sunlight. So the difference between the two is that one is made from petrochemicals that degrade easier, and the other is made from plant-based products. To tail off on my second point of biodegradable single-use plastics, let's go into plastic as a hero against food waste. To mitigate food waste, plastics are used as a tool to help in global food production. For example, in Europe, over 12 million farms produce food products that are distributed globally to over 500 million consumers. And that's not even taking into account other continents such as South America or countries such as China or the United States. Supermarkets tend to use plastics to help preserve fresh food and conserve these valuable resources, such as foods that go rotten easier, fruits, vegetables, meats. This form of international transportation of food takes a lengthy amount of time, in which without plastic packaging, these goods would no longer be able to be consumed at all. Plastic packaging in the food supply chain is a necessity because it supports safe distribution and lessens food waste. Food waste does also have ecological disadvantages at the same level as plastic waste does, if not more. As high amounts of foods degrade, it does produce methane emissions that are 25 times more harmful to the environment than carbon dioxide from burning off plastic. Methane has a higher rate of trapping heat into the atmosphere, which is a leading cause of climate change. So banning plastics from grocery stores can also cause harm to the agricultural industry. Agriculture accounts for 70% of the water that is used globally. If the food that is being produced does not get consumed because we have more food waste from no plastic packaging to preserve these foods for longer, then we are ultimately contributing to water waste and furthering our negative environmental impacts. So unfortunately, there is no perfect world where we can have our supermarkets be plastic free, but because of these plastics, we are able to lessen our water waste and lessen our food waste.
On top of all that, plastics also have many social benefits. Consider the depth of items that are packaged with single-use plastics. Food items in the grocery section, electronics, toiletries, sporting goods, and even clothing are packaged with single-use plastics very often. If single-use plastics were replaced or removed, some other material would need to be used. No renewable material is as tough or as compact as plastics are in those regards. Simple items that are packaged in a thin layer of plastic, like candy bars, would have to have some other, most likely bulkier packaging to replace the plastic. This would mean that trucks, trains, and planes wouldn't be able to carry the same amount of product per load because more space would be taken up by this bulkier packaging. That would mean shipping the same amount of items would become more expensive. That cost ultimately would be carried on to the buyer, the consumer, who would have to shell out more money for the same products that they were receiving with convenient and cheap single-use plastic packaging. Perhaps the greatest social argument for keeping single-use plastics is the job market that it produces. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that almost 750,000 people were employed in the plastics and rubber manufacturing industry in 2020. The U.S. only accounts for 13% of the world's plastic production, meaning that millions more people around the world lose their jobs in plastic manufacturing factories if single-use plastics were written off the books. Shifting away from plastics into renewable materials such as wood or metal would also place a much greater strain on those industries. Forests would be cut down at higher rates, and mines would release more emissions into the atmosphere. Also, the jobs that were lost in the plastic industry would have to be moved to more rural areas where these organic materials are available. In many situations, single-use plastics are the best material for the application. One very important example is plastic shopping bags. Many people avoid using plastic bags because they think they're the worst option for the world in terms of renewability and recycling capability. However, they fail to consider the costs of producing the bags relative to their so-called better alternatives like paper bags and cotton bags. During production, not only are plastic bags less costly in terms of water usage, but they also contribute less to the depletion of the ozone per single bag that's produced. A paper bag, for example, must be reused 43 times to match the environmental cost of production that one paper bag did to produce. A cotton bag requires 7,200 reuses, and an organic cotton bag requires almost 20,000 reuses. To put that into perspective, if someone were to use their organic cotton bag twice a week to go grocery shopping and they filled it up each time, they would have to go grocery shopping twice a week for 192 years to equal out the increased cost of production that the organic cotton bag did relative to a plastic bag, according to the Danish Environmental Protection Agency. Not only can plastic be the best option for a given application, sometimes it's the only option. Produce packaging, for example, is almost always plastic for a handful of reasons. Sealed plastic bags increase the shelf life of fruit and vegetables, which reduces food waste massively around the world. Plastic bags for produce also allow seasonal items to be stocked for a larger portion of the year, as they last longer and don't spoil so fast. Plastic is non-permeable and protects produce from germs and pathogens that it may encounter during travel. On top of that, if a reusable alternative was used, there would need to be a massive infrastructure in place to collect and redistribute billions of small containers for fruit, vegetables, candy, chips, and nearly every other food item, as most things are packaged with plastic. This infrastructure doesn't exist at all today and would be extremely expensive to carry out. Perhaps a more important use for plastics, which doesn't really have an alternative, are laboratory and medical settings. Consider the amount of syringes, gloves, vials, petri dishes, IV bags, and so many other things that need to be sterile and clean when being used every time. The only other alternative that is reusable to plastic is surgical steel for many of these uses, which is costly and time-consuming to clean. And if there's a mistake and for some reason an instrument isn't cleaned properly, someone can be cross-contaminated with an infectious disease, or a laboratory sample can be ruined because of cross-contamination.
In conclusion, we contend that single-use plastics should not be banned due to ecological, social, and economic considerations. Beginning with our ecological reasoning, emergency supplies such as healthcare products and disaster relief products are often made of single-use plastics, and banning single-use plastics could be detrimental to both those and many other vital endeavors. Secondly, single-use plastics can now be made from biodegradable materials, which could provide an environmentally conscious compromise to traditional single-use plastics. Finally, using single-use plastics to preserve leftover and unused food can greatly reduce food waste, which provides a host of ecological benefits. Moving on to our social reasoning. Single-use plastics are by far the cheapest option for packaging of many products. Switching to an alternative source of packaging could make everyday products, as simple as toilet paper and potato chips, dramatically more expensive. Secondly, the impermeable nature of plastic makes it ideal for preserving product freshness. Switching to an alternative source of packaging would reduce the shelf life of many products and make many products impossible to sell in stores altogether. Finally, Plastic and rubber production is a major source of employment in the US and globally. Moving to an alternative source of material, which would likely only need to be made once, could put nearly 1 million Americans out of jobs. Finally, moving on to our economic reasoning. First, single-use plastics require far less material to make than any of the alternatives, which make them cheaper to make and thus create cheaper products for American and global consumption. Next, switching to alternative materials would mean a massive infrastructure overhaul, which would be hugely expensive and would have ripple effects through many industries, which could lead to our final point. Switching to an alternative source of material could create market instability because it has trickle-down effects over many industries, which could cause global economic instability as the markets adapt to the new regulations, not only immediately, but also for years to come. In summation, we believe that conservation efforts would be much better focused in other areas such as renewable energy. Thank you.